Start recording. Has it told you that it started recording? Brilliant. Okay, guys, thanks so much for coming today. So today we're doing the popular science writing training. And obviously that is a big word in itself. And even though today we're going to be talking about the context of short articles and summaries, which are about 250 to 500 words, so half a page to a page. The stuff that we'll be talking about today is completely transferable and applicable to things like books, magazines, newspapers, blogs, radio prompts, TV shows, podcasts, anything really. So it's a really useful transferable skill to have, I think, and something that you could take on in your clinical psychology careers if you choose to work in with the public in that context. So in the context of the Iman project, we are obviously doing this for our journal club. We'll be taking that one paper and we'll be writing a summary about it in a popular science writing style. But I want you to go away from this training learning about basic popular science writing tools and skills that will essentially help you communicate science. I want you to go away with these skills that you can apply to all the writing that you might do and even all the talking that you might do and how you choose to structure information for people in the context of psychology. And obviously we will be talking about psychological sciences, and obviously the entire audience for today is psychological, but this can really be applied to any science. So just to give you a little bit of background about where I've kind of learned the skills that I'm going to be kind of teaching you today. So I would still classify myself as a bit of an amateur science writer. So I am currently a science communication sub-editor with Research Hive at the University of Manchester, and I'm an assistant editor with the BPS Minorities Group, and I'm a student member of the Association of British Science Writers. A lot of the training that I've done has been sort of self-training, so, online modules and stuff like that. Reading books and reading archives, which I'll share with you today. But three really good trainings that I went on were popular science writing training by the MRC, writing about your research training by the Royal Society, and blog and opinion writing training by the Manchester Biomedical Research Centre. And I just want to give credit to these organizations today because I'm going to try and incorporate not just the things they've told me, but also my experiences and just give you some basics from everything that these guys have taught me today. So basically, I think when I see writers start out, especially psychologists, people who go into undergrad and are immediately taught academic work, they go into it straight away off the bat, kind of thinking that science writing is all about making the paper accessible, which is great, but they think that's it. So they don't really curate anything else. They take the paper and they basically just translate it from a scientific language into an easy to read language, an accessible language. And so the article they write will be exactly the same. They'll go into a whole history and background about why this thing was a problem and why it needed to be fixed. They're giving the reader an idea for why it was an issue, just like a paper gives a scientist an idea for why the research needed to be conducted. And then they'll talk about what the researcher did and how they did it, and they'll explain it in like really easy to read terms. And then they'll go on to finally tell you what they found towards the end. And they'll say all this in really accessible terms, but unfortunately, all of that defies the purpose of a good popular science writing article, because by the time your reader gets to the key message, they've stopped reading your article. So with a popular science writing article, it's not just about translating it from an academic language to an accessible language. You have to completely flip it. You have to curate the content. You have to cull it and edit it, and then you have to structure it for your audience. So I would say that there are 3 steps to crafting a really good popular science article, no matter what the length is. This can apply to 4-page feature-length articles, and this can apply to bite-sized paragraphs that give you, the key message within one headline. First, you need to know the reason for why you are writing. That reason is going to immediately tell you who your audience is, and your audience is immediately going to tell you your fundamentals, which is what is the content you should be focusing on, and how should you structure that content. So in today's presentation, that's exactly what I'm hoping to do today. I'm first going to really briefly just go over some of the reasons we might choose to write and the corresponding audiences for those reasons. But then I'm mainly today going to focus on what content we should focus on when we decide to turn a paper or papers into popular science writing articles, and how we structure that content into an article. And then I'm going to share some resources with you. So there are many reasons we might choose to write. Yes, we might want to report our findings to the scientific community, but we also might want to inform clinical practice. We might want to inform policy change research practice. We might want to apply for grant applications. We might want to do it for journalism, to dispel misinformation, or we might want to politicize the information or sensationalize it. Or what we're going to be talking about today is that we might just want to be informing and entertaining the public, because that is the ethos of popular science writing. It's popular because it's informing and it's entertaining. So for each of those reasons, there is a pre-made existing audience. So for reporting findings, there's academics and scientists. For policy change, there's policymakers and government officials. For grant applications, there's the grant panels, which can be experts and laymen. For informing and entertaining, you have the actual public themselves, and that's everybody. And that's through the media, it's through magazines, social media. Like we said, there's so many different outlets, but basically everyone is your audience. Now, when people hear that, they can get a bit overwhelmed, because that's like saying, well, you have all these guests with different palates and tastes coming to your house for dinner. What are you going to cook that everyone's going to enjoy? But so if you're getting very overwhelmed, there are ways that you can narrow down what you're going to talk about. You can narrow down your target audience. So tips on narrowing down. You can look at a study's demographics, because it's natural that who a study has focused on is probably going to be who that study is going to appeal to. So you can look at the study demographics, the ethnicity, the gender group, the age group. But you can also get a little bit creative and see if there are any parallel groups or fringe groups. So that, for example, if a study has focused on children or teens, your target audience would definitely be children and teens. But it might also be the parents of children and teens. It might also be schools. It might also be people who are planning to have children. If your study was on a particular group of people who have a certain disease, they are your target audience. But it might also be people who have risk factors for that disease. It might also be people who are in a certain age group for that disease. If it's something like, dementia, it might also be, carers for those with dementia, professional, and, family and friends. So, you can narrow your audience down a lot, but you can also maybe broaden it slightly. So that's up to you on how big or small you want to create your audience. But before you start writing your article, knowing who that audience is incredibly important, because when we talk about content, we're going to start thinking about how your audience is going to think about the subject matter, and that's going to dictate what you write. Now, again, it might be that no, you want to write for everyone. Your audience is everyone, or you don't know for sure who will read your article. And that's okay, because there are certain characteristics that apply to everybody. When your audience is everyone, there are certain things that apply. When we say the general public is self-involved, it is not enough for your article to be interesting and relevant. It needs to be interesting to and relevant to the reader. And you'll learn more about this when we talk about content. But when the reader reads your article, they need to see themselves in that article. They don't need to be spoken to. They need to read this and see that this could be about them. And I'll show you some examples of writers who've done this really well. The public has limited attention spans. I mean, we're psychologists. We hear about this all the time. It's spoken about for days. We're competing with so much information. We're competing with the internet. We're competing with phones. We're competing, it's the age of technology and information, and obviously misinformation. So people have not even minutes sometimes, but seconds to see what you've written. So if yours is not interesting enough than what's out there from the get-go, so you can't wait for your article to get interesting. It needs to be interesting from the beginning. And again, we'll talk about that in content. And similarly, the audience is very busy. We don't know what they're busy with, but we can assume the audience is very busy. And that again plays into limited attention spans. So you have to make your articles short, snappy, and to the point. And then base scientific knowledge. This is a very important one. So there have been a couple of studies on what the average sort of scientific knowledge is of the public. So in the UK, they kind of did studies based on magazine readership. So basically, there's this magazine, New Scientist. Some of you may have read it. It's a really good magazine. I'm going to be using a lot of examples from it today. And they do popular science writing and lots of articles, and it's subscription based. So people who read New Scientist are people who are actively seeking out science information. And they found that the average New Scientist reader had the scientific knowledge of a 17 to 18-year-old. So that's about AS to A level. And then there was the journal Nature, and Nature also has a magazine and a blog. Some of you may know about it. And it also is very expert. People who seek out Nature are those people who are actively seeking out scientific knowledge. They also, again, their average scientific knowledge was 17 to 18-year-olds scientific knowledge. So none of it was specialized. It was, just the basics about different scientific subjects. And then they went down to the readership of The Guardian. So Guardian is something that kind of pops up on all of our phones, so we don't have to actively seek it out. Their scientific knowledge, on average, was that of a 14-year-old. So now it's less than GCSE level. So in the UK anyway, so probably if we went on a global average, it's probably less. But in the UK, we can assume that the readership of the scientific knowledge is at least 14, if not less. So that is the level we should be talking at. Now, that does not mean that our audience is not intelligent. And this is where the saying comes in, that we're not supposed to overestimate knowledge, but we're not supposed to underestimate intelligence. When given the opportunity, the reader is perfectly able to understand scientific concepts if explained to them correctly. And that's what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to talk down to them. We're just supposed to explain correctly. So that is what we're going to do when we get to content. And when it comes to content, the first thing your article should do from the get-go, without hesitation, is say what your piece is about and why should the reader care. So what is about? How can you decide what your piece is about? This should be an easy answer. It should be, oh, whatever the paper was about, that's what my piece should be about. Sometimes yes, but not necessarily. Sometimes a study has done a lot. Not all of it is necessarily interesting to everybody. Not all of it necessarily found anything. Sometimes it's the little intricate things. So you need to kind of take the time to ask who, what, when, where, why, and how about the paper. Ask this not as a writer, as the reader. Ask questions like, who is being studied? Would a reader care? Who was affected? Would the reader care? Who did the study? Would the reader care? When did it happen? Would the reader care? Think about all of this. And this is when I said, you know, it's all about your audience. You need to do this with the audience and your reader in mind. This is where frame of reference is really important. I'll give you an example, actually. So I was reading in New Scientist, an article, and in that article, they had said that when you use more hand gestures and stuff, when you present, it makes you're perceived to be a better speaker and you perceive yourself to be a better speaker. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And that's what the study had reported. But the writer had gone a step further. They'd really looked through the findings, and the writer reported that actually the findings were only found in men. They didn't find this in women. The paper hadn't really explored this very much, but the writer went on to explore this. So I think this would be really valid as a reader to a woman, like, oh, this is interesting, tell me more. Are they going to do this study in women? Or what does this mean for women versus men? And this gets a little bit of a dialogue interested. So these are the little things you can do when you're reading a piece. An example from our journal club that we just read. So the piece that we just did about therapeutic ruptures, our audience might be, you know, potential clients. So when we read it, we might be thinking, you know, as clients, are we susceptible to this? Is this happening to us? How are we being protected? What does this article say about this? Stuff like that. So explore what the reader is going to be interested in with regards to this paper. Now, don't spin stories. Don't, you know, take assumptions or make, you know, big leaps. Report what's there, report the facts. But this is about being critical. This is about critically analyzing what the paper is telling you. And then make sure it's the first thing the person reads. So when we talked about limited attention span and when we talked about busy lives, so these are examples from New Scientist. And if you read the first few sentences in both these examples, so in the first one, data reveals racial bias in recruitment. People from ethnic minorities are less likely to be contacted by job recruiters than people from the majority group, according to an analysis of users on a Swiss public employment website. From the get-go, I know exactly what the article is going to be about. I know how it might be relevant to me. So as an ethnic minority, it might be relevant to me. I know that it took place in Switzerland. I know exactly what's going on. Not even a question to me. It's written incredibly accessibly. This is an informative sort of article. On the flip side, we have an entertaining one. Owner's personality rubs off on their dog. Dogs with certain behavioral issues are more likely to improve during training if their owners are extroverts and open-minded. Immediately, I know what this article is about. I've just been told that if I'm more extroverted and open-minded, my dog might behave better. People are obsessed with dogs. We know this. As someone who loves dogs, as someone who might want to have a dog, this might be of interest to me. As a potential pet owner, this might be of interest to me. So don't make people guess what the article is going to be about. Put it right there. That means that even if they don't get to the end, they walk away with the key message. These are examples of slightly longer articles. So BPS Research Digest, you could see that even though they didn't put what they found or what the focus is on in the first paragraph, they went straight for it in the second paragraph. That's fine. This is acceptable too. And I'll explain why it's acceptable as we go on. So in this one, they're kind of exploring why people who believe in harsher punishment, people who believe in pure evil support harsher punishment. And I really kind of found this one interesting because with very few words, they were able to tell us a lot. And the reason for this is if you focus on this sentence, focusing on mass shootings in the US, the team once again finds a relationship between belief in pure evil and harsher approaches to punishment. This once again reinforces immediately to the reader that this is not the first study that has found this finding, that this is something that has been repeatedly found over and over again. Such a quick and easy way to let a reader know this fact. That's just good writing. It may seem very simple, but it's just done very well. And these are the little things that you pick up on as you start reading other people's writing and you notice these things. Same with this kind of new scientist piece. From the first sentence, you're not getting a long introductory paragraph. You just need 2 sentences to tell you that burnout was always an issue, but COVID has just exacerbated it. You're not forcing people to kind of go through a whole paragraph, but already with 2 sentences, you've evoked emotion in them, but you've also told them exactly what the piece is going to be about. So that's just really what I wanted to emphasize, that immediately people should know what a piece is going to be about from the beginning. So the second part was that a piece should address why the reader should care. You have to make the piece relevant to the reader and important to the reader. Try your best, if possible, to frame the story around the reader if you can. So this can be done by making the story emotional if possible. So for example, if we're doing therapeutic ruptures, we could talk about how anyone could be a client and how it can affect them. So there's several ways to do this. So sometimes you might go from single person to bigger picture. So in studies around physics, they kind of do like, oh, we're all a little speck in the universe kind of thing. In our kind of studies, it can work, if your study is a case study, you can talk about how that case study is a protagonist in a story. And often I've seen writers, they talk about that protagonist in the first paragraph and what that protagonist has gone through and things like that. But the second paragraph will talk about statistics of how many other people go through the same thing. And it kind of brings to light, oh, we could all be that protagonist. So it brings a single person to a bigger picture, if that makes sense. Similarly, you can also do bigger picture to single person. So if you have a large study, which has really generalizable findings, you could always say, well, these findings are quite generalizable to the bigger population. And of course, you are part of that population. So it's all about frame of reference again, making it about the reader. And then, of course, you've all seen those articles which talk about from the get-go how knowing something or being aware of something can benefit the reader. And we don't mean it in a, oh, these 5 steps will help you lose weight kind of thing. But I'll show you more examples of like the right way we can frame this, where from the beginning you tell the reader that, oh, this has long-term benefits and short-term benefits. And the reader will be like, oh, if I read this, it's benefiting me. So that's relevant to them. It's important to them. They know that there's a benefit within this article for them. So I'll show you how. And I'll also show you how it's not just the content itself that can be made all about the reader, but actually the language that we use that could be all about the reader. So this article, I did it really well. Just have a look at the way they phrased that title. If we don't feel socially accepted, we get more defensive when we've done something wrong. So they could have said, if people don't feel socially accepted, people get more defensive when people do something wrong. But they've said we. They've made it all about, a collective, like this includes you too. When you go on to read the article, they said when you've done something wrong, big or small, they've made it all about the reader. They've posited a hypothetical situation for the reader. They've immediately made it all about the reader, like, oh, this could happen to you. What would you do? And in the end, they even put a question towards the reader. But why do we get defensive? And what can we do to minimize those negative consequences? They've now forcibly engaged the reader. This is an example of tools used correctly to make a reader think that this is them, this is a situation they could be in or might have been in, and what do they actually think about it? And maybe they should read further. And this kind of language, you see it again over here on the example with the Guardian. Don't worry, be happy, how your state of mind could affect your COVID jab. And so this is, again, it's used 2 techniques. First, it's used that language again, your state of mind, instead of how state of mind could affect COVID jab. And again, it's kind of telling the reader, like, there's a potential benefit to reading this piece. Like, oh, if I read this, I could, it's better for my outcome when it comes to the COVID jab. Now, you don't have to do this with every single piece that you do. I mean, and that's the thing, you have to kind of balance how you use all of these tools. So for example, if you look at this one over here on the right, people easily distracted by their phones perform worse on memory tests. For this one, they didn't need to say if you're easily distracted, because most people are easily distracted by their phones these days. So most people will see themselves in this. So you got to pick and choose. If something is looking to be, oh, this might not seem relevant to everyone, you could twist the language a bit and be like, okay, this might work. But if something seems like a very commonplace topic, like the phone thing, you might not have to. A piece shouldn't assume knowledge. So this goes back to what I said before. Don't overestimate knowledge, but don't underestimate intelligence. So your audience are not experts, and they've not come to your piece to become experts. So that's why we're not giving them that whole background knowledge. That's not essential. They've come here just to learn a little bit about this little topic that you're going to tell them about today. So as you write your article, think about the bare minimum knowledge they need just to understand this piece. Think about what knowledge they currently have about it. So going back to that readership statistic, so, the knowledge of a 14-year-old. Think about what questions they will have as they read your piece. So as you're writing, think, oh, what question might come up as they read this sentence? Are you answering that question in the next sentence? If you're not, why? So if a question comes up, it shouldn't take a whole paragraph to get the answer. It should come in the next sentence. Basically, they shouldn't require any prior knowledge to understand your piece. And they shouldn't need to read the whole piece to understand the beginning. They should be able to understand it as they go. A piece shouldn't have jargon. So jargon would be any technical, scientific, or academic language. And I would say this rule actually applies to most settings today, I think we shouldn't have jargon in conferences. I think we shouldn't have jargon in clinical settings. I mean, we should really try our best to eliminate jargon wherever we can. I know there are some, so if you can, try to use the simplest and most accessible terms possible. If you absolutely have to use jargon, define it first. And this is a technique that the Royal Society suggests, which is reverse definition. So instead of saying, this can lead to psychosis, a condition in which you can lose touch with reality, say, this can lead to a condition in which you can lose touch with reality, known as psychosis. The difference is, when you reverse and you give the definition first, you've explained the easy concept first, the thing that they're going to understand really easily, and then you've given the technical term. That means that they're not going to waste time processing the technical term and miss out on the definition. So it's bottom-up processing instead of top-down processing. A really good example of this is this one in New Scientist. If you read the second sentence, indeed, it turns out that the worse we are at a particular task, less likely we are to recognize our own incompetence, something known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. So if we started off with, it turns out, the Dunning-Kruger effect, a lot of readers might be so busy trying to remember what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, they won't properly process the definition, they'll have to read it over, it can frustrate them, and as we've established, people have limited attention spans. If they get too frustrated, they'll stop reading your article. With the reverse definition, it's also, if you find that your definition is short enough, give the reverse definition, give the technical term, and then just keep using the definition. Don't use the technical term. You can use this opportunity to just inform them of that technical term once, just to kind of make an educating moment. But then for the rest of the article, use the accessible terms so they don't have to keep coming back to that technical term, keep having to read over in case they're getting confused. I know this isn't always possible, especially in psychology where some terms have truly long definitions. But if it's turning out to be just 3 words or so, go ahead and just use the accessible language. And then when it comes to psychology especially, we know that the public has co-opted a lot of our technical words. So words like depression, psychotic, sociopath, psychopath, OCD, they don't mean the same things to the public that they mean to us as psychologists. So even though when we say something like depression in an article, it might not be what a reader is imagining depression to be. We know that depression encompasses many complex symptoms and occurrences, whereas the public perceives it to be sadness. So in an article, we might have to take a sentence or two to describe what depression actually is. And then of course, for example, something like psychotic, as psychologists, we know what that encompasses, but again, what does the public hear when you say the word psychotic? So you would have to define it. So if you have the room in your article for a sentence or two, you can do something like what the New Scientist has done here. I think they added a bit of texture to their piece. Over here, they went into a little bit of the history in just 2 sentences and gave a bit of understanding and depth to the meaning of bore out. So, which I think was really interesting. So they kind of like dispelled that it's not the same as burnout, and just kind of explained what it was. So I thought that was rather interesting. So if you can do that, it can add a bit of depth to your piece. And I think we can use this to explain concepts like psychotic and like OCD, which people think is just cleaning all the time and stuff like that. And we should do for things like mental health problems. A piece, especially in the psychology world, which is so abstract, can very much be benefited from analogies and metaphors if done right. You have to be super confident when using analogies and metaphors. If it's taking you a lot of sentences to explain, that probably means you don't understand it really well and that you shouldn't be using it. So the benefit of being a psychologist, again, is that psychologists use a lot of metaphors. If anything I've seen in the pandemic is that we're using metaphors for absolutely everything to explain psychological concepts. We're using them in social media posts. I'm seeing them very much in articles. And I think we're very much benefited by using that as a tool for the public. So to use a metaphor, the Royal Society and the MRC provide a framework for how you come up with one. So think of the concept you want to explain. It could be a mental health problem. It could be a therapeutic relationship. It could be whatever you want, the identification. Think about it at its most base level, an abstract level. What does that concept do? Or what are the steps? What is involved in it? And then try to think of something everyday that has those steps. I know it sounds really basic when you think about it, like, oh, this is kind of obvious, but this is how you develop a metaphor. So think of something that does those steps exactly, and then just test the analogy. Does it work? How far can you take it? In that sense, is it simple to explain, or is it taking a lot of words to explain? If it is, scrap it. But if you can explain it in 2 to 3 sentences, it's probably good to go. Obviously, one of the really good examples has been the bucket example, which is that, we all have buckets with a tap. Our buckets fill up, but we have the tap where we can, release with our fun activities, but lockdown plugged up our tap and now our buckets are overflowing. And I've been seeing this one used in articles all over the place, and it's been clicking with people and people understand. And then I've been seeing, obviously, there's the spoons metaphor and just all these kind of metaphors in the psychological world that are working really well for people. So absolutely use metaphors if you can. And one of the benefits of metaphors is that it can make a concept really good and concise. And at the end of the day, a piece should be good and concise. So use active voice, cut out useless words. Now, there's nothing wrong with using descriptive words here or there to evoke emotion and paint a picture, get the scene kind of set. But don't make it too flowery. Once you've set the scene, get to the facts, explain what's going on. Use everyday words over formal words. You want to make it accessible. Vary your sentence and paragraph length. So there have been actually studies on this, that it's more pleasant to read articles and the flow is easier when your sentences are of varying lengths and your paragraphs are of varying lengths, as opposed to just equal sized blocks and equal sentence lengths. So keep it varied, because that actually mimics human speech. And then instead of using vague information like lots of people or it was very hot, give accurate information. 1 in 4, 25% off. Temperatures were 35 degrees. This is what speaks to people, accurate numbers that they can picture in their head, not something abstract that they have to imagine. Because lots of people could be, 1 in 20 for somebody and 1 in 4 for somebody. So you want to give people an accurate idea of what's going on. And we've said that a piece should be relevant to the reader, but a piece should also be relevant to the context of what's going on. You don't want a study that's aged out. You don't want a study so it used to be that if a study was over 10 years old, it was too old. Now, sometimes a study can be 3 years old and it's considered too old. So, it's tough. I would say that relevance depends on what else has been done in that area. Maybe there's a study that was done in 2001, but it's the only study that's been done in that area, in which case it is the most relevant one. But that in itself would be a point for readers, like, no one else is studying this area? Why? So have a look at if it's the most relevant one, and don't be afraid to see what gaps exist in that study. So when we, reviewed our study in our journal club, we weren't afraid to tear that study apart. We found gaps that existed in that study, and that's important. I know that, we're summarizing articles, but part of that is also critically analyzing. You need to see what they've done wrong, what they could have done better, even what they've suggested that they could have done better. And you can incorporate some of that in your article. And I will give you an example of how some articles have done that. So don't be afraid to critically analyze pieces. So once you've done that, you have your content, you've applied all those ideas, and you've made it all about the reader, you made it concise and beautiful, you've explained from the get-go what it's going to be all about. You might be thinking, okay, but how do I structure this content? I know what my message is, but how do I structure it? And the temptation, as always, will do it like the paper, introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. No. The popular science writing approach is the exact opposite. You immediately start off with the conclusion and key findings. And from the examples that I've been showing you guys, you might have noticed that as well. They immediately start off with exactly what they found. And then later on, you will explain how they did that, and then go into maybe a little bit of the nitty-gritty. So then you increase the details, like of the actual results. So this many participants, and this was the result. And as the details increase, the importance decreases. And the logic behind that is, okay, it's getting less important. So if a reader scraps it at this point, it's okay, because they're walking away with the key findings and the key message, and that's what's important. We've done our job of entertaining them with the key finding and informing them of the key finding. From the beginning, you find out what the conclusion is, you know what the key findings are in the second paragraph, and then they kind of go a little bit into the methods. So here they describe, the participants, what happened to the participants. And if a reader wanted to go on into that, they could. But over here, you know exactly what's happened. And then later on, decreasing detail, increasing detail, decreasing importance. And over here, they even went on to critique the implicit association test a bit as well. So you get that little critical analysis that we asked for as well, and that's important. And then just a little summary if you wanted to. So this is an example of, I would say, well-crafted piece. It's short, it's easy, definitely accessible to an audience. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about, if you have a little bit more space, you can add something, few short sentences right above your flipped structure. And this is called a dropped intro or hook. So the dropped intro or hook, it's used to engage your reader. So you might have noticed in the previous article, they had that little paragraph right before they talked about the key finding. It was that hypothetical situation where they draw the reader in, like, oh, could be you kind of thing. That was a dropped intro. So, see, dropped intro. So a dropped intro can be a question that you pose to the reader. It can be an anecdote. It can be a reference to something that's going on. It can be hard-hitting statistics. It's basically something that makes a reader focus on your piece, think, oh my God, what is this person talking about? It makes them stick to the piece long enough to get to the second paragraph where they find out what this piece is going to be about. So basically, it's a little it's the bait that gets the reader to what is the piece going to be about. And I'll give you some examples of how writers have done this. So this piece in New Scientist, the dropped intro is very simple. It just started with a question. Are you suffering from burnout? Immediately, any reader who is going through burnout right now will, or might think they might be going through burnout, might not even know what burnout is, but they might think, oh my God, what is burnout? Am I going through burnout? This is a question. It immediately actively engages a reader by nature of what a question is, it engages a reader. So by using a question, you have now created a relationship with the reader and they are forced to engage. So this is an example of a hook. So are you suffering from burnout? The reader will be forced to read that paragraph, and then the second paragraph would tell you what the article is going to be about. This is an example of a slightly longer dropped intro or a hook that I used, which combined questions. So in this, I created, so this is a piece that I actually did. And this had me runner up for the Max Perth Science Writing Award. So I used my dropped intro to create a hypothetical situation for readers where I made it so I had them imagine that a cognitive test, they have to take a cognitive test, but it wasn't designed for them, but they might still be diagnosed with dementia, even if they don't have it. So I started asking them questions like, but what if you're Caucasian and I asked you to read a Chinese idiom or memorize words in Arabic or recognize an illustration of a doll? You'd probably fail on more than one task, but it wouldn't be attributed to dementia, but a mismatch in language and culture. And then in my next paragraph, I talk about my study and how it's important to the public and but the dropped intro immediately kind of draws attention to the reader in terms of, well, it could be me. What if, it was in my shoes, that kind of stuff. So again, using questions to paint hypothetical situations. This is a dropped intro from a person's personal anecdote. So this is from a clinician who works in a dementia setting. And they're describing their experience of working with dementia patients and their children, and how those children would often wonder if they're gonna develop dementia and if they can prevent it. So they have described that feeling of that person kind of stopping in the doorway in the clinic and how that experience is. So you're painting a very emotional setting, emotional scene. So that's their personal anecdote. So this is an example. And then after this kind of setting, they went straight into facts and figures about dementia, how this is affecting people and what people have found and stuff. So again, going straight to the key findings. So that's a dropped intro. This is an example of a dropped intro where it wasn't the writer's anecdote, but it was someone else's anecdote. So this was an article on the effects of psychedelics on depression. And it was an overall sort of epidemic at a certain period of time, but they kind of juxtaposed it with the story of this person and his personal experience. So throughout the article, they kind of went back and forth with the issue that was occurring and this person's story. And they start off with like how this person crashed their motorbike into the wall of his parents' house. So the first paragraph is just the story of how he crashed. And then the second paragraph went straight into how this was an issue. So they could kind of afford to make it a huge narrative about this person and their story because it was a huge feature length. It was quite a big story in The Guardian. But again, very good use of how you can use a hook for the reader. This is one of my personal favorites. So if you read it, this is an example of using something high profile that was going on in the media to create a dropped intro. It's a really discombobulating thing to think, I know you're wrong, but you are now more confident in your lie than I am in the truth, comedian John Oliver told The Hollywood Reporter last year. He was talking about a high-profile Twitter spat with Donald Trump, which began when Trump claimed that he had refused to appear on Oliver's very boring and low-rated show. Oliver denied inviting Trump, who then upped the ante, claiming he had been asked several times and had repeatedly turned the show down. Trump was so adamant that Oliver wondered if he had forgotten something. This was a dropped intro on a piece on gaslighting. And the piece then talked about various studies on gaslighting and what gaslighting is and how it affects people, and gaslighting in the context of abuse, and which you would never guess from a hook like this, which is kind of funny, kind of plays into pop culture and what's going on in the media and the news. But this is something that people might start to laugh at, they might read it, they might get hooked in, and then they immediately get pulled into this very serious article and this very serious matter. So yeah, those are some examples of dropped intros, and that kind of wraps up everything on structure. And really the kind of basics that you need to know about science writing. Obviously, writing is a never-ending journey, to be honest, but you can do really well starting from there, knowing who your audience is, and then curating content for that audience, and then structuring it in that reverse way, and then playing around with these hooks and dropped intros. I find, honestly, the best way to get better at science writing, it's a cliche, but just reading other people's writing, it truly helps. The more I read other science writers, I see how they talk about facts, how concise they are, how they're able to create narratives, but use, honestly, limited words to create those narratives and the best words to create those narratives. And it makes you a better writer by reading that writing. I think BPS Research Digest is a great place to learn that kind of writing. So you're getting psychological knowledge, you're keeping up to date with psychological literature, and you're kind of refining your writing skills by reading as well. If you're interested in just really getting into science writing, these are examples of some really great books that I found to be really resourceful. If you're looking to actually write for places, these are places you might want to consider. So obviously the big boys that would require a lot of practice and refinement are places like New Scientist and Lateral Magazine and PLOS ECR and stuff. But you can always try for BPS Research Digest, Guardian Science, The Conversation, Massive Science. Obviously BPS has so many different outlets at this point that we can write for. And then there are many free online resources. So Massive Science and The Conversation have online trainings that you can do and online lectures with slides that you could just kind of study on your own. Things like, how to find a story, how to find a narrative in a story, how to come up with a pitch, things like that. The National Association for Science Writers has resources. The Association for British Science Writers has resources. Guardian Science has an archive full of articles written by their science writers, which you can read, see their best tips. I'm going to try and show you one of my favorite resources, which is the Open Notebook, because I find it to be very accessible. So are you guys seeing the Open Notebook website?
Yep.
Awesome. So this is the Open Notebook. It's a completely free resources. It's created by science journalists. They do events, and they're the ones who created this book, The Craft of Science Writing. But recently they've started this free science journalism masterclass, which is 100% by email. So it's on your time. Basically what they do is, I'll give you an example. Their first one was how to find an angle for any science story. It had 6 lessons, and basically they would just email you the lesson, and it would take less than an hour to do the little lesson with a little bit of homework. So it could be like a 5-minute task, maximum 20-minute task. It was incredibly doable. And they have upcoming ones, how to pitch stories that sell, how to spot scientific hype and misinformation. You don't have to attend the lecture. It doesn't cost anything. It's just a little email that gives you, I guess, better tips to write. They have all of these resources and lecture slides on science writing, basically. And I'm trying to find where they have, I think it's this one using narratives. Yeah, these are written lessons from existing science journalists, basically. So if you wanted to sort of go through these, see how people have written about different things, some of them are also mental health based writers. So yeah, that is basically it for today. Basics on popular science writing with a focus on summaries for a lay audience. Do you